Jesus never wrote a manual on how to do church. And yet, within decades, communities of believers were thriving across the Roman world, even in cities the apostles had never even visited. How does that happen? How do you get a functioning, connected, resilient movement without a detailed blueprint? The answer is stranger and more interesting than most people assume. Jesus spent his ministry teaching people how to treat one another, forgiveness, love, humility, care for the outsider. That was the substance of his teaching, not a church model. And when his followers absorbed this, it became what the New Testament calls the Apostles' Doctrine, not a set of rules for church order, a way of living and treating others. Look closely at the book of Acts, and you find something surprising. The early believers are described as continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in prayer. That's it. That is the entire description Scripture gives us of what held these communities together. 4 practices, not an organizational chart, not a manual. So here's the question worth sitting with. What happens when a group of people actually commits to just those 4 things? If you strip the 4 practices down to plain language, what you will get is believers treating each other well, building healthy relationships with one another, seeking to be genuinely involved in one another's daily lives, eating together regularly while building real intimacy over food, and praying together as they share each other's burdens, carrying these burdens before God as a community. Now imagine a group of believers living in the same neighborhood who take these 4 commitments seriously, not as items on a checklist, but as a way of life. What emerges from that? Historians and careful readers of the New Testament increasingly argue that what will emerge is something very close to what we call the early church model. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because it organically grew that way. Look at what each commitment produces on its own. Take shared meals. A group genuinely devoted to eating together often doesn't stay abstract about it. That devotion becomes a recurring, intimate gathering in their homes, not a service, a meal. That single commitment is enough to produce what we'd now call a house gathering. Take the commitment to being entangled in each other's daily lives. Once people's lives are genuinely interwoven, sharing work, sharing burdens, sharing resources, decisions stop being private. What do we do about the widow with no income? Who handles the dispute between 2 believers? These questions require the community to gather and decide together. So this same commitment naturally produces a second kind of meeting, a decision-making gathering. Prayer works the same way. People truly bound to one another don't just pray privately, they carry each other's burdens to God together, which becomes an actual recurring practice, a prayer meeting. And the commitment to treating each other rightly requires ongoing instruction. There has to be teachings where the community is equipped to see and understand what that kind of life looks like in practice. This is very likely where the apostles' doctrine was delivered in its clearest form, an elder or minister teaching the gathered believers what kingdom life looks like. This is what Jesus did, and this is what he passed down to the apostles. This was exactly what Peter was doing in the temple courts in Jerusalem's earliest days, and almost certainly what the apostles were doing city after city. Not running a worship service, but instructing people in how to treat one another and how to live as a society according to God's will on earth. Notice what just happened. None of these gatherings were planned as strategy. Each one emerged directly out of a single commitment, faithfully kept. A teaching gathering, a meal gathering, a decision-making gathering, a prayer gathering. Different purposes growing out of the same root. This is what it means to say the church's structure was organic rather than designed. The gatherings were the visible shape that 4 invisible commitments took once people actually lived them out. Consider how most first-century churches actually began. On the day of Pentecost, Jerusalem was full of Jewish pilgrims from across the Greco-Roman world, from Rome, from Asia Minor, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia. Many of them encountered the apostles' message that day and later carried it home with them. And when persecution broke out in Jerusalem, believers scattered even further, fleeing into cities throughout the empire. Here's what's notable. In city after city, these dispersed believers didn't wait for an apostle to arrive and organize them. They found each other. They started living out those 4 practices together, and a community took shape. Without a founder, without a franchise model, without a rule book. This reframes something people often get wrong about Paul. It's commonly assumed Paul planted most of the first-century churches. He didn't. Several of the churches he wrote letters to weren't founded by him at all. The church in Rome existed before Paul ever set foot there. The church in Colossae wasn't planted by Paul either. It likely emerged through the work of Epaphras, a local believer. Even the churches in Crete, which Paul instructed Titus to help organize, weren't founded by Titus or Paul. They were already there. So where did Paul's letters fit into all this? Not as founding documents, not as constitutions. His letters, like those of the other apostles, were written to address specific problems a particular community was facing: conflict, confusion, false teaching, ethical failure. They're pastoral correspondence, not organizational manuals. And that pattern itself tells us something. The apostles were comfortable letting structure emerge locally. They corrected error. They didn't necessarily impose uniform structure. This is where the picture gets genuinely fascinating, and where scholarly opinion has to tread carefully, because if structure wasn't imposed from the top, and if it emerged locally from a shared commitment to 4 basic practices, then we should expect enormous diversity across different cities and communities. And that is exactly what the historical record shows. The church in Corinth doesn't look identical to the church in Ephesus. Different challenges, different cultural contexts, different degrees of maturity, even different theological disputes. Modern readers, understandably, want to find the early church model, a single blueprint they can extract and replicate today. But the deeper you look, the harder that becomes to justify. There may never have been one uniform first-century model to find. What there was, instead, was a shared commitment, a shared starting point. 4 practices applied by different groups of people in different cities under different pressures, producing structures that were related to one another in spirit, but not identical in form. This raises a genuinely open historical question, one scholars still debate. How much of what we call early church structure was intentional design, and how much was simply the natural byproduct of ordinary people trying, imperfectly, to live out those 4 commitments together? The evidence suggests the latter played a far larger role than most modern assumptions allow. But certainty here is limited. The sources are fragmentary, the picture is incomplete, and historians continue to argue over how much organizational intent to read into communities that left us so little explanation of themselves. What does seem clear is this: the first-century church wasn't engineered, it was cultivated. It grew the way a living thing grows, shaped by soil and context, not stamped from a mold. And that leaves modern readers with an uncomfortable, or maybe liberating thought. If a group of people today committed themselves, genuinely, consistently to those same 4 things, would something recognizably similar emerge? Not a copy of first-century Corinth or Ephesus, something unique to its own time and place, but built from the same raw material. Maybe the question was never, what did their structure look like? Maybe the real question is whether we're willing to commit to the same 4 things and find out what grows. If this kind of historical exploration is valuable to you, consider subscribing. There's more of this ahead. And here's a question worth leaving in the comments. If structure really did emerge organically from those 4 practices rather than from a plan, what do you think that says about how the church should approach structure today?